Okay, we are on chapter 3. I will label this as a video as 3A, so that it's the first half of chapter 3. We're going to go, I don't know, what is it, about 12 pages or so until we get to the church in the pews. So as we did in the first couple of chapters, this first part is really about the big ticket issues. The second part is really more about how those big ticket issues influence the day-to-day life of your average Christian. So how this will look on a Sunday, or how this will look about how you might live your life and follow a feast and fast calendar, or what kind of church you would go to, or what you might see, is really for next time. This time we're going to more talk about kind of the big historical issues, the socio-political stuff that's shaping things, and then we're going to kind of hit kind of the big important people and events that will then filter down later on. So we have now moved from a medieval Middle Ages time period to the Renaissance. And that is the overarching issue that will filter down into everything else that happens, is the fact that Europe, Western Europe in particular, is undergoing a period of time starting in the late 1400s and moving on for the next, couple hundred years, as often described as the Renaissance, the rebirth. So what that's looking like sociopolitically is kind of how we switch from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. And we were talking last week, or the last couple of sessions, about the three overarching things that were happening in the world, that everything else is kind of falling underneath its influence. And one of them was the church is the connected tissue of society. The second was the feudal system. I think that was the second one. The third one was Islam, the rise of Islam. Was the second one feudalism, and just the kind of the smaller tribes are starting to form into larger groups that are starting to have kind of a united self-identity. And then you basically have regular people who live on the property of a lord, who then has responsibilities underneath the larger lord, and on and on and on. You've got this kind of political hierarchy. So we're going to take those same three things, but we're going to translate them, because this next phase of a couple of hundred years, we're going to see a change in each of those three pages, each of those three issues. So starting from the back, because this is where it really comes from, the spread of Islam, which I'd said it was not just an existential threat for Christianity in Western Europe, but it makes a geographic split between East and Western Christianity. One of the primary world events that it's kind of seen as the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the Renaissance, will be the fall of Constantinople. So the Eastern, the Byzantine Empire, Eastern Rome, that has been now kind of geographically split off from the West, and the West has fallen. We've got kind of the Holy Roman Empire, which is an outgrowth of something kind of different, honestly. But the East really preserved as much as possible of the Roman way of doing things in its own kind of Eastern format. Islam eventually, the Turks, the Ottomans, I shouldn't say the Turks, the Ottomans, move into that area and eventually conquer Constantinople, and the Byzantine Empire basically falls, is absorbed by the Ottomans. So when Constantinople falls, you have a couple of things happen. Number one, Islam kind of calms down with its expansion. It's now been checked in Western Europe. where it's trying to push into Europe, and now multiple times it's been stopped. The Moors have now been mostly expelled from Spain and the Iberian Peninsula. That will kind of come to its conclusion around the time that Columbus sails in 1492. A little bit before that, though, is the fall of Constantinople and kind of the end of Byzantium, the Eastern Christian Roman Empire. So when Islam kind of turns down the heat on its spreading and conquering, because once it absorbs Byzantium, there's less places for it to go. So it kind of just pauses for a while. That accomplishes a couple of things. A lot of the Christian scholars flee Constantinople and Byzantium. So where are they going to go? They're going to go to two major places. They're going to go into Russia, which considers itself the third Rome, Eastern Orthodoxy, taking shape in places like Moscow and St. Petersburg. And then they're going to also spread back into Western Europe, where there is safety and they are not under Ottoman rule. The other thing is, if Islam and through the Ottoman Empire kind of takes a pause in its expansion and its kind of aggressive wars against Western Christianity, they start trading and talking more. Both of those things are going to take the wisdom of the East, where people like Aristotle have always been preserved, and they're going to bring that philosophical tradition of Greece and the Greek philosophers and the older parts of Rome, and they're going to bring them back into Western Christianity, where they had kind of fallen out of favor or been forgotten. So the Renaissance, part of it at least, will come from that rediscovery of the Greek philosophers. It's going to come from that rediscovery of some of the wisdom of the East that after East and West split, the East preserved and the West kind of neglected. So a lot of the intellectual concepts that we think of about the Renaissance, humanism and taking the human potential as being something significant, the dignity of the personhood, the exploration of creativity through the arts, a rebirth in architecture, in technology, people like Leonardo creating things, or Michelangelo painting and sculpting things. A lot of this will be sparked through the rediscovery of Greek and Latin and Eastern wisdom that had been either forgotten or neglected. So as that is happening, you were having people with brand new kind of explosive creative expression and all sorts of the arts and writing and technology. We call it a Renaissance. It's easy to say, okay, at this event or at this time period, everything changed. It was the Middle Ages, boo, it's very dark. And then the Renaissance, oh, hooray, that's great. The reality is it's a big mishmash, and the transition is way more subtle. The Middle Ages were never as bad as people like to think, and the Renaissance were never as awesome as everybody likes to assume. And there's not a dividing line where a switch was flipped and we went from the Dark Ages to Enlightenment. It's a much more natural progression than that. But it's still very true that substantial things were changing.
So did the Easterners coming over sort of brought them out of the Dark Ages because they brought in knowledge?
Well, again, I don't want to call them the Dark Ages. I think calling them that, there was plenty of wisdom, there was plenty of learning when this middle-aged time, but getting an influx of new ideas or getting an influx of old ideas that had been forgotten or had been neglected sort of sparks a lot of this new experimentation in thought and in art. So, for instance, what we see in the beauty of Michelangelo's sculpture owes a lot to like ancient Greek sculptures and those forms and some of those renderings, that whole technique and that whole way of representing things kind of gets rediscovered. There'd been a period of time in the Middle Ages where if you look at like paintings from the 1600s versus paintings from the 1200s, the one of the 1200s looked really, really different because they were highly stylized. Everything was making a theological point or was making a philosophical point. So people didn't look like a picture of a person. They looked like an image of a person that had code words and suggestions and hints of what they were supposed to be. In the Renaissance, you have sculptures that look like real live people. You have paintings that look like real representations of a person or a scene as though it were a photograph, or at least much more closely than it used to. And some of that is a rediscovery of what the Greeks had already done. Some of their technical work, some of the ways that they represented people. Like you see some of these ancient Greek statues and they look like real people. That had kind of fallen out of favor for a long time. So some of this rediscovery of the wisdom of Greek philosophy and art, plus other things from the East, kind of sparks some new interest. And these are exciting ideas that people begin pursuing in new directions that they just weren't thinking about before. So that's definitely a part of it. It's not the only thing, but it's a real part of it. So what is also happening in a natural outgrowth is the rise of the nation state. And that's another big deal. So we had gone from the tribes that were like the Germanic tribes that were harassing the Roman Empire hundreds of years before, the Goths and the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths and the whatever Goths. Those, after the fall of Rome, those tribes begin to coalesce, and we begin to see more of a people group where, the Franks, which will rise into Francia, which will eventually become something that identifies itself as France. Same thing with the Germanic tribes, and these little nation states begin coalescing into what we would consider countries. And that's different than it happened before. The feudal system begins to solidify, where the top level lord has now kind of consolidated enough land where we're talking about someone as a king. And the feudal lords underneath them, you start getting this very stratified, very codified system of dukes and earls and counts and lord, whatever. That grows over time, but especially as the tribes begin to, those feudal lords start to coalesce. And then now we've got what's unifying this group. What used to be the Catholic Church was the unifying factor. What's starting to unify these larger areas is a national identity. We are not a group living in this area that is common to the group living in that other area because we're all Catholics. We are French. We are Prussians. We are English. So the rise of the nation state with this very kind of formalized sense of hierarchy and royalty and succession, because being a king basically has two major roles. One is the governance of your land, and two is the issuance of the next generation so that your nation may be cared for on a consistent basis. You need to have a son. You need to have an heir. You need to have the next in line so that the nation can remain solid and stable across the generations. So who's next is always in the minds of kings and kingdoms now, because we've moved from these tribes where everything restarts every single generation. If the chief of your tribe gets challenged by somebody else, and that somebody else beats him in combat when you have a new chief, it's like you're always starting over. You never build on what you have. But when these feudal lords like really consolidate a lot, and people start to identify with a common language, with a common culture, and with a national identity, you want to preserve that. You don't want to lose it just because somebody dies or somebody gets challenged to a duel. So you want to have a plan of succession. And the more formal the hierarchy gets, the more formal the plan of succession needs to be. That is a major issue that will kind of spill over into a lot of stuff, especially within the church. Now, speaking of the church, the unifying factor of the church has been under attack. So we kind of ended last week with this sense of the popes and the anti-popes, and the church was now no longer over all these other feudal lords and kings and everything else. They were now seen as equals, and if equals, potentially rivals. And kings had enough power where they could dispute the Pope and say, oh yeah, well, I'm not going to do what you say. And the Pope was like, whoa, that's weird. I used to be able to tell you to jump and you would tell me how high. And now you're saying you don't want to do what I want you to do. What do I do with that? And then starting to settle disputes between two warring kings. And if the king is strong enough, he actually runs into Rome and kidnaps the Pope and takes him back. And he says, well, you're going to do what I say. And you're going to proclaim me as the winner of this dispute, or I'll kill you. Whoa, okay. Now, suddenly the church is not only, you're not the unifying influence if you are not over things. You are now equal or potentially under. You know, who is the authority within one of these new nation states? Is it the king or is it the Pope? And this issue is going to play out throughout the Renaissance and throughout what we will understand as the Protestant Reformation. So many of these countries will have to come to a reckoning. Who is the supreme authority within my land? Is it me, the king, or is it the Pope as the head of the church? Before that was unquestioned. The church is our unifying factor, and if the Pope is at the head of it, then the Pope is the head of everything. But now we've got a nation that is strong, and it's large, and it's consistent, and I've got a plan of succession, and I'm making treaties and allies with another nation because my son is going to marry his daughter, and now we're going to join stuff together in the future, and we're going to be even bigger and even more solid and stable. And so anyway, these are the things that will be at play. What will be the nature of the church as not just a unifying factor, but within the overall authority structure within these new nations? And that's what's going to bring us into what will grow through the Protestant Reformation. This is a rough time for the church. Popes are being held hostage. Multiple popes are being proclaimed by different countries. Oh, you're going to kidnap the Pope? Well, I'll just name a new one who agrees with me. And then we'll have offsetting popes. So this whole concept of the Pope and the anti-Pope is just basically, at the time, there were rival people both claiming to be Pope. You're only named an anti-Pope after the fact. Once the church made a decision, who was the actual rightly ruling Pope, whoever's left over was considered an anti-Pope. Not meaning evil, just meaning against. So there's a lot of turmoil, and there is a lot of transition. We're now also past the Crusades, and the church has seen a weakening of its influence. If you've called for these Crusades and you've really sort of encouraged these kings and lords to spend their treasure, their people, their lives, and it's not worked out, or it's not lasted, or it's not amounted to much, then suddenly people are going to start wondering, well, what good are you anyway? Your advice is bad, or your advice is trouble. So also remember that within this feudal landscape, where it's about land and property being owned by a particular person who then is underneath somebody else, and so on and so forth, the church has land all over the place. Wherever there is a church or a monastery or wherever the church just sort of owns property, and that property is used to grow land, to grow food, or to house tenants or whatever. So the church has always been one of the major landholders wherever it's been. Who's in control of that land? To say the church feels very vague because it was. Ultimately, it's going to be down to a person. Maybe it's the local bishop. Maybe it's the local priest. Who is the person who makes decisions about that land? Who is the person who says, you're allowed to grow this, but you can't grow that? It's not going to be the Pope, because the Pope is a million miles away, and we have no way to call each other or to email each other. Someone locally is going to have to be in charge. And so that typically winds up being the local clergy, whether it's the bishop or the priest. Well, bishops and priests grow old and die. So now there becomes an issue, just like the kings are worried about their succession. Who will be in charge of this country when I'm gone? I need to have a plan. I need to have an heir, so on and so forth. The church also needed a way to preserve its land and have a sense of continuity. You can say, okay, well, the Pope can just appoint a new bishop. Fine, but that might take a while. And what happens in the meantime? And how long is it going to take for word to reach Rome that they need a new bishop, and then for them to make a decision and send it back and then to get everything in place? A lot can change over what could be a period of years. So what happened was bishops and priests basically started acting like feudal lords. This is my personal property. This is how I'm going to maintain it. This is how I'm going to oversee it. This is how I'm going to protect it. You're a feudal lord. I'm a feudal lord. So they started acting the same way. They were collecting the money for the property, or from the tenants, or from the way it was farmed. They were the ones who were making decisions. And many times they were the ones passing it along to someone else. And who do you want to pass it along to more than a child? Clergy were often married at this point, and it was not only seen as a simple solution to pass it along to your children, this land, the church property, the job of being the priest of this church, it also became a way for a family to consolidate its power and influence. Like, I've worked so hard to be in charge of this place and to act like a feudal lord. I don't want to lose that. I want to pass it along so that my family is always cared for and always protected and always doing well, never struggling. So my son will be the priest after me, or he will be the bishop after me. And that presupposes that your clergy is getting married and having children. So this became a big problem. Number one, there were scandalous behavior, because if clergy are getting married and having children, then clergy are doing other things too, outside of marriage and outside of children. There are problems if we are going to use this as personal inheritance when they don't have children in wedlock, but they have children out of wedlock. Then who's the heir? And it gets super complicated. It also reinforces this concept that it's personal property rather than being a steward on behalf of the church, or a steward of this property on behalf of God. It then becomes personal property. If I'm married, it's where my family lives, and I can pass it along to my son or my daughter, or whatever. So this becomes all a part of the problem that the church is struggling with at this point, that the church is having a lot of trouble with the quality of leadership that it has. Because if this becomes hereditary and it just gets passed from son to grandson to great-grandson, some of those are going to be bums. Some of those are going to be crooks. Some of those are going to be jerks. And even if one of the generations was good, there's no way to ensure that year after year. And once it becomes seen as a birthright, there's even less rationale for being a faithful priest, because it doesn't matter. I'm going to get all this stuff anyway. I'm going to get the job anyway. I'm going to get the land anyway. So the weaknesses and abuses of the church start getting related to all this stuff. What we consider now about, oh, a Roman Catholic priest can't get married, they're celibate. So that is not church doctrine. That is at the level, this is a technical thing, that is a level of discipline. But this is about the time frame where the church says, we got to fix this somehow. It's gotten way out of control. They institute the discipline, and it is a discipline of the Western Latin Rite of the church. Almost all Roman Catholics are what we would consider the Western or Latin Rite, but not every single one of them. There are branches of the Roman Catholic Church in other parts of the world. They're very small, but they exist. Eastern Rite Catholics, Maronite Catholics. They are under the Pope. They are in the overall hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church, but they were allowed to operate more independently because where they were located and what their culture was. But in the West, where all these things are happening with feudalism, they made the decision that as a matter of discipline, clergy will take a vow of celibacy. They will not get married, and they will not have sexual genitive relations that may result in offspring. We're going to cut off this issue of passing it along to your son because it's a mess. We're going to cut off this issue of you thinking that the church building and the land are your personal property that you're going to pass on to somebody else because it's no longer yours. That is still the case. The Latin Western Rite of the church has maintained this discipline of celibacy ever since, and Eastern Catholics don't. Eastern Catholics can get married. Certain clergy, such as Anglican priests who become Roman Catholics, may stay married. If they do so in the West, this is a trivial point, in the Western Rite and Latin Rite, I have some friends who were Episcopal priests and now they're Catholic priests. They can stay married. They are married Catholic priests. There's not a lot of them, but they are there. They can have kids, whatever. But should their wife die, they are not allowed to remarry because now they're under the discipline of everybody else. You cannot marry once you are a Roman Catholic priest, but you can be married if it happens in advance. It's a little trivial point, but where that comes from is really the excesses of this time period that they're trying to correct. Now, if you've got a lot of bums out there, a lot of bishops who kind of just the nepotism of dad or grandpa or my rich uncle got me this job, a lot of bad decisions are being made throughout the hierarchy of the church. And the church is in a real mess right now. This is the ground that faithful people and clergy within the Catholic Church start saying, hey, stuff is wrong. It shouldn't be this way. What can we do to fix it? What can we do to reform it? The most famous of which will be a Catholic monk named Martin Luther. He is a German Catholic monk. He is a faithful priest. He has kind of a personal renaissance as he is struggling with how poorly run the Catholic Church is, as he is struggling with a lot of the theological implications of the bad decisions the church was making. One of the issues at the time was the sale of indulgences that really riled him, that he saw as incompatible with the early church and incompatible with Scripture itself. Partly to pay for the debts incurred through the Crusades, partly to reestablish the authority of the church as it's being challenged by these new nation states. There's a lot of building happening in Rome. St. Peter's Basilica, some of the things that we associate with Vatican City and the splendor of that is happening at this time, and a lot of it to reassert the authority of the church as it's being challenged by kings and princes and nation states. So we are going to build the biggest, most beautiful, most elaborate churches to glorify God, but to also remind you that the power and authority of the church is here. It's in this place and it's alive. Well, how are you going to pay for it? Indulgences had been around for quite some time. The idea being this, after your death, what happens? Even in the trust of your salvation through Christ, everyone kind of recognizes that there's no perfect person. So that when you die, your human weakness, something has to change before being in the perfected presence of a holy and almighty God. So everyone seems to be in agreement, even still, that there's some difference between the frailty of our mortal life and the perfection of immortality granted through salvation in the presence of God. The church, remember, in its scholastic Middle Age era, was trying to think through all of the little tiny details of theology. They were intending to love the Lord thy God with all their mind, and so they're really breaking stuff down into the smallest pieces as possible. What about this, and what about this, and what about this? So the concept of purgatory, which is sort of stemming from some scriptural references, some sections of epistles, most notably in Peter's epistles, about a time of similarly in the Old Testament, but some kind of purification, some kind of, as the dross is eliminated from gold as it's heated up, so it becomes pure. Talking about the spirit still in prison. So starts formulating this concept of how do we explain what happens between the frailty of our mortal life and the perfection of immortality in the presence of God. Whatever that change is purgatory. As the more they think about it, the more they start kind of coming up with trying to explain it, trying to give it detail, trying to flesh it out. Well, it must be this, and it must be that, and this is how it works. So purgatory was then seen as this time of purification. Through your salvation, which was assured in Christ, you are not prepared yet at your death to be in the holy presence of God. Your sinfulness from your mortal life must be burned off. It must be purified. And they started delineating, well, it must take a period of time then. Maybe it's years, maybe it's centuries, who knows? The indulgence then was then to reckon how to minimize your time in purgatory so that you were out of it more quickly. Different things could do that, such as going on crusade to the Holy Land, such as works of service or mercy to the church or to those in need. Something about your moral life and your moral choices that the church could then say, all right, you are working off something that no longer needs to be purified, so your time in purgatory will be less. Well, then that becomes a business. It reminds me a little bit of carbon offset credits. I, as a rich company, want to burn all my fossil fuels, but I am going to pay you, company, for planting trees in Belize that will offset, and I can say my company is very green. That's kind of a modern use of indulgences in purgatory. You now have middlemen who say, well, I'll do the work of doing the mercy, and if you pay me, I will give you the time off. You can benefit and it becomes both the church selling it, and you even have like resellers, like middlemen, who are trying to sell these indulgences, and it gets way out of control. From moving from an encouragement and offering practical ways that people might shape their lives here and now to look more like Christ, to suddenly being a money-making scheme, becomes kind of this sort of miserable low point within the theology and practice of the church. This is the state of things when a German monk named Martin Luther says, no, this is not how the early church understood things. This is not how I read scripture. This is wrong, and it's got to change. So when he nails his 95 Theses to the door of Wittenberg Cathedral on October 31st. These are his line item bullet points of his problems with his contemporary church as he saw it and the things that needed to change. So it looked more like the early church, so it looked more like scripture, and so that the theology would go back to its more pure sense of understanding God's gracious, unmerited favor and love towards us as being the sum total of our salvation, rather than chasing worldly good and works to prove and earn some salvation or some time off in purgatory. This was hot stuff, real hot stuff. It challenges the way the church was currently operating. It points out the ways that the church was doing wrong. And when you do wrong and you've gotten into some really bad habits, and somebody says, you know what, that's a really bad habit and you should change it from this to that, we can kind of respond in two separate ways. The first way is, oh, you know what, you're right. I had kind of just sort of gotten used to what I was doing. I stopped paying attention. Thank you for reminding me. I will change it. Or you can get mad. How dare you? Oh, yeah, I don't do that. And even if I did, it's not wrong. So what we get a lot of early on is less the first and more the second. The church is ticked that Martin Luther would challenge it so directly and insult and impugn its dignity. The Diet of Worms, should be pronounced Worms, is basically where he is taken to task to say, you have stepped out of line. You think you're doing a good thing by pointing out flaws, but in your pride, you are actually becoming a real disruptive force, and you are doing wrong. You're insulting. This is bad, and you need to go take a time out. You go back to your monastery and be quiet for 20 years, and then you will be reinstated. And Martin Luther said, well, then forget you. I'm out. And was excommunicated. This is a massive turn of events. What could have been either a small kerfuffle that gets swept under the rug, or what could have been an opportunity for change and reform. You read Luther's writings, and early on, he never had any desire to leave the church. He wanted the church to recover what it ought to be already. Well, he is removed from the church, and he just says, well, fine, I'm out of here. This is the beginnings of the Protestant Reformation. And people hear what he says, and they agree with him. The nation states, the kings and princes and stuff like that, start getting told by the church hierarchy, you better put this guy in prison. You better take his followers and get rid of them, or censure them, or quiet them, or shut them up, or kill them, or something. And you have a couple of interesting responses happen. This could have been snuffed out quickly if all the other countries and all the other kings took the side of the Pope and the church and said, yeah, we don't want this to happen. It never would have gone anywhere. It could be that some of these rulers believed him, believed Martin Luther. What you say seems true and right to me. I too can read the book of Romans as Paul writes about the grace of God through Christ, that it is by faith we are saved and not a work of man. And I think you're right. I'm not going to turn you over to the church authorities. I am not going to stop you from preaching. As a matter of fact, I believe you. Preach to me. That's a possibility. Another possibility is certain kings or rulers think, oh, somebody's standing up to the church. Count me in. Whatever they say, I don't care. But the church is now my political rival. If I'm the king of France and I want to be in charge of France without any rivals, I don't want to have some pope tell me what to do or tell my people what to do. Well, then by all means, if somebody wants a movement that allows Christians to no longer be under the direct authority of the Pope, but maybe under my direct authority, sign me up. So between these two perspectives, and I'm not saying it was either or, there could have been both for some people. But what could have been snuffed out by the secular authorities very quickly was actually allowed to continue and spread. And the more it spreads, along with these same ideas of the Renaissance, where people are exploring philosophies and new inventions, and there seems to be just this kind of explosive air of trying new things and seeing how it might turn out. You have other new reformers who begin taking shape of what Luther started in their own way. Protestant is a name that comes relatively early on. There is definitely an element of protest. We are protesting the excesses and abuses of the church. We are protesting the church's response to Martin Luther, but also understand that protest in this regard has an archaic meaning we don't use very much anymore. It's a little closer to proclamation. So it's not just protesting like rah, 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 we were with it. It's also proclaiming in a more neutral sense. We think of protest with like, you know, people marching with signs in the street and arguing, but this has an element of that, but it also simply means proclamation. So we have these other major new reformers. We have John Calvin, who will be in Geneva in Switzerland, who goes even a step further to say, I'm not only in agreement with Martin Luther that we should go back to the New Testament and revise our theology. Let's go back to the New Testament with how we operate and govern the church. We don't need popes. We don't need cardinals. We don't even need bishops and priests. If you look at how the early church was described in the book of Acts, you have elders and overseers, and there's not a real super distinction between them. So why even have priests? It's the priesthood of all believers. Paul wrote that. Paul wrote that, so that must be true. We don't need the ordained clergy to act as a sacrificial priest as an altar. That ended with Israel. What we need are overseers and elders. So a Presbyterian form of government, which comes from the Greek word presbyteros, elder, as we would see in an English translation. Overseer, episkopos, bishop. Well, in the early church, those were all kind of mixed and matched. So Calvin is like, with the priesthood of all believers, we don't need a priest, we'll just have elders. We will have presbyters. This church will be Presbyterian. We have people who push it even further than that. You will hear about Zwingli, who is referenced, who is one of the forerunners of the Anabaptist movement, or will grow into the Anabaptist movement, that really challenge the whole concept of the sacramental life of the church. There are no sacraments. We've gone from Martin Luther agreeing to sacraments, then to John Calvin, who's like, we're not going to call them sacraments, but I kind of get what you're saying, to Zwingli, who say sacraments don't exist. We don't have the Eucharist, we have the Lord's Supper. There is nothing about this bread and wine other than a tangible reminder of what Jesus accomplished on the cross. And in baptism, this is where we recognize what God has told us to do, but that is an adult public proclamation of your faith, not an opportunity to see God's grace at work regardless of age or ability. These are the things that are churning all along, and the theology is being challenged. The way the church is governed is being challenged. The way the church has an authority structure is being challenged. And the nation states are on board. You start seeing the reformers who are operating within a particular nation state start having these major growths and identity within that nation state. The Geneva of Calvin begins to spread in that entire area, and it becomes a Protestant area rather than a Catholic area. It doesn't mean there aren't any Catholics, but it means within this nation state, as Calvinism begins to spread, it begins to shape the identity of that nation. We are a Calvinistic nation state. We are a Protestant nation. We are a Protestant people. As the nation states are now jockeying and vying between them, this can be a way to distinguish themselves. Some of these German principalities are Lutheran. We're not Calvinist, like you Swiss. The French Huguenots, within the Netherlands and Holland, these were once a part of a wider Spanish empire that gets split off, and they become extremely Protestant, partly for theological reasons, but also for political reasons, to say we're not Spain. If the way that we live our worshipful lives and the religion of our people is different than yours, Spain, that's very, very Roman Catholic, well, we're not very, 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 very Roman Catholic. And it helps draw a very clear line between we used to be owned by Spain and now we're not. So you've got all of these political as well as theological reasons for why these new churches are springing up in particular areas and kind of spreading throughout a wider culture or a wider country. What happens in England will happen. It's often blamed on Henry VIII wanting to get a divorce and the Pope saying no. It is actually a super complicated issue. Partly because we, kind of come from that line, and I think it's worth us talking about for a second, but also to underscore just how complicated these things are. I'm going to take a moment and I want to give a little bit of background to what it means for Henry VIII to form the Church of England because he wanted a divorce. Henry VI goes crazy. He is, whether it is illness, whether it's hereditary, he becomes he's mad. He is incapacitated, and he's unable to run the country. What do you do? What do you do when you have a king? You've been born into it and coronated and everything else, but you can't run it. What do you do? Who's next in line? And there were very small children. There were other relations, nephews, cousins, people who can trace their own lineage to other kings. And there is an enormous dispute about that. And then Henry VI kind of is in his right mind for some period of time, but now there's already a new king. What do we do with that? And then he goes crazy again. This results all of this turmoil, all this confusion, and a need for stability and succession with two branches of the royal family fighting it out. The Yorks and the Lancasters, that we refer to now as the War of the Roses. Each branch of the royal family taking a different color of rose as their sort of family symbol. One was red and one was white. And we have not just competing claims to the throne. Well, I'm closer, or my claim is better, or he said I could have it, or whatever it is. It pulls the entire country into a state of civil war. It pulls other countries in, like France, because England has holdings in what we would consider France. It is decades of warfare, bloodshed, of some of the worst excesses of what happens when there is no clear line of succession. We have a conquering king in Edward IV on the Yorkist side, who basically wins the battles and can say, I, by right, am the king. He gets sick and he dies, and we start all over again. His sons are too young. His brother steps in, his brother Richard II. Is he Richard III? Anyway, the one that that Shakespeare calls a humpback with a limp. My horse, my kingdom for a horse. All this sort of stuff is happening because the warfare never stops. The brothers start fighting within themselves. The other family is still fighting. The whole nation is continually on the brink of self-destruction. And it takes another family member who has been in exile to form an army to come over and to resolve this. The War of the Roses and all of the various factions are finally resolved by Henry Tudor, who after he wins becomes King Henry VII. It's his son who will eventually be Henry VIII. I give this as background and context because the whole concept of Henry VIII wanting a divorce and starting a new church because the Pope wouldn't let it doesn't occur in a vacuum. It doesn't happen because Henry VIII was just, he had no self-control or he was full of self-importance. His dad, he was born one generation from his entire nation on the brink of destruction because of civil war and succession, not having an heir, not having a son, having disputes about who the heir was. So him being able to produce an heir and a clear line of succession is like an existential crisis. They just went through decades of this. Tens of thousands of people died. So his dad would finally resolve it. Like, this has to be first and foremost on, this is my responsibility. I have got to have a male heir. We cannot go through another civil war. And so his first wife, who had actually been married to his older brother Arthur, who died young, was then the Henry, who never expected to be king, was now raised up. And this is Catherine of Aragon, so this is an extremely important kingdom in Spain. They are married, and it was ostensibly a marriage of love. They will stay close to each other to some degree for the rest of their lives. But she cannot produce a male heir. And so the argument that Henry makes is, I know the church says divorce is a sin. However, she was married to my brother. I should not have ever been allowed to have married her because of the laws of consanguination. This was too close of a family relation. And so this is not a divorce I'm asking for. It is an annulment, meaning the marriage was never technically sacramentally valid. And the Pope said no. Now, did the Pope say no out of purely theological reasons, or was there also some political capital to be made? And it's real messy. So Henry VIII, and I'm not trying to defend Henry VIII saying he's a great guy. There's a lot of Henry stuff that he did that was a real mess. But I think having an understanding of how England splits from Rome has to take into account some of this wider context. His hope, his desire, his need for a male heir, and to then be able to point for some pretty justifiable reasons why he should be able to get married again, and getting denied, and having some reasons to be suspicious about why he was denied, finally said, ultimately, who is in charge of the church within my nation? Is it me as its sovereign, or is it the Pope who's way over there? And we know over the last few generations has been, kidnapped and replaced and on and on and on. This happens within the context of the wider Protestant Reformation and Revolution. It's not the only thing. All of these pieces come into play. But as Henry makes the split and basically says, well, if I'm in charge of the church, my ruling is I get to have a divorce and I get to remarry. So he does. It doesn't go well. The moral of the story perhaps is be careful what you want, because maybe it's going to cause more problems. We can go through all of his lines of various wives, and it never really works out. He does finally have a son who is crowned king after him, but he barely reigns at all because he gets sick and dies. And it winds up going first to his older daughter, Mary, and then eventually to his younger daughter, Elizabeth. Within this turmoil, the Protestant reformers within England see an opportunity. The theologians within England see an opportunity. Oh, he just cut off ties from Rome. He's now the head of the church. This seems like the perfect time to say, let us help you set it up. And by setting it up, we can set it up in a Protestant fashion. The Book of Common Prayer, written first by Thomas Cranmer, is occurring within this time frame, basically having the need to set up how the church should run and how the church should look. And then reformers like Cranmer seeing this as an opportunity to start making some changes. Mary will be a counter reforming presence. She was deeply Roman Catholic like her mother, Catherine of Aragon, and tries to roll back all the changes that happened during her father's lifetime, persecutes those reformers. This is where some of those theologians are martyred, are killed, or burned at the stake. After she is deposed, we have Elizabeth, who then those Protestant reforms are given freedom to go even further than they did. It's not, it's not nothing. It's worth noting. Earlier in his life, Henry VIII was not only a staunch defender of Roman Catholicism, he actually wrote some theological and scholarly defenses of the church to the point where he was awarded by the Pope with these special awards of being defender of the faith. When he splits off from Rome, the church in England still basically looked like it always did. It was just he was in charge. And it's as he is getting older and dying, the reformers start shifting stuff. Mary comes in, pushes it way back. Elizabeth comes in. The reformers are allowed to restart, and they take it like, we're not going to slow play it like we did under Henry, because if something happens and we get another Mary in there, we're going to go whole hog and we're going to go right now. And then off it goes. So we've got all sorts of things happening at this time period. We've got the Renaissance technological innovation of the printing press. So now Bibles don't have to be written by hand by a monk. They can be printed out. If they can be printed out, that means they can be distributed where people can read them in their own homes. If people can read them in their own homes, then maybe they should be reading them in their own language. So there's now, before it was going to be preserved in the Latin because that's the language of the church, or perhaps in the Greek or Hebrew. And now you've got people who are saying, no, let's do it in the language that people can understand it, because we can print out a copy and they can actually read it. These are all revolutionary. These are all amazing changes where average person could read the book of Romans for themselves that didn't require the explanation of a priest who was fluent in Latin. And they could see what it said and they could start thinking for themselves, well, what does this mean? And what does it mean to me? Some of this we're going to talk about next section, because now it's filtering down to their personal life and how that's going to look on a more individual basis. But these are the wider issues at play that are really not just reformatory within the church, truly revolutionary. You are now, as it mentions in this book, and this is a very Catholic perspective in this book, but even this, you can now, for the first time in the West, be a Christian without being a Roman Catholic. Before, those terms were synonymous. To say you were a Christian meant by implication you were a Roman Catholic, because that was it. That was your choice. You were a Roman Catholic or you were nothing in the West. The Eastern Orthodox always preserved their own. But now, after the Protestant Reformation, you can now consider yourself a faithful Christian of whatever stripe, of whatever denomination, of whatever fellowship. And they start springing up all over the place. And every time two reformers disagreed with each other, bloop, they just split off again. And then those disagreed with each other, bloop, now we split off again and again and again. And now you've got not just the church, you have churches, plural, multiplying and expanding. We can say what good it is for people to have the scriptures in their own tongue, in their own hands, and to be able to make these decisions that affect their own souls. we can also say, but now you've replaced one pope with 1,000,000 popes. Because if every man is in charge as the captain of his own soul or whatever, now you've got 1,000,000 popes. And now you've got no agreement, because every time you have a disagreement, well, fine, I'm just gonna start my own church. Is that the body of Christ? Will we keep splitting and splitting and splitting and splitting? Where we have no need of compromise or rationale or cooperation. We can pick up our toys and we can move whenever we feel like it, because that's basically what happens. And we can say, oh, but isn't that the way it ought to be, that people can read and make decisions for themselves? Okay, but you know what? Not everybody makes good decisions. Maybe one of the benefits of having the teaching magisterium of the church was the sense of continuity and reliability. When you let people choose what they think something means from scratch, whenever they want, you're not going to have 1,000,000 different opinions. And most of them are going to be wrong or crazy or weird or shifting. Because I thought one way yesterday and tomorrow I'm going to think something else. Because we now have no common foundation. I am not arguing against the Protestant Reformation. I'm just saying there is none of this that is without problem, without sin, because these are all human institutions we're talking about, and they're all fallible and frail. We are not getting rid of problems and moving into perfection. To many degrees, we are simply trading one set of problems for a different set of problems. Maybe not all problems are created equally. Maybe some problems are worth getting rid of, even if you have to take on new ones, because those new ones aren't quite as bad. But there are still problems, there are still failings, there are still frailties, nonetheless. Anything else? It's a lot. This is the fire hose, because we had one chapter to talk about all of this stuff. And extremely little detail, because we can take any one piece of that, and they've written whole books on one little piece. But I just wanted to give us the gist of what was happening in a wider sense, especially kind of in that worldwide sense, because the stuff we're going to talk about next time is how that's going to filter down. What is it going to look like? You know, what does it mean to be a Christian in England in the 1600s versus being a Christian in France or in Prussia in the 1600s? And those are going to start looking more and more different all the time.
Yeah, and it's gonna cause a lot of arguments between the peoples over their chosen.
Absolutely. When you've got two nation states, but are united by a common faith, they have a reason to still work together. When you have two nation states that are now, their faiths are seen as distinct. I've got a different language than you. I've got a different culture than you. We eat different food and we worship differently than you. You now have basically almost complete rivals.
Yeah.
And when you have complete rivals, they tend to argue with each other and they tend to want to fight and find a winner. And the Renaissance will be an example of that time and time and time again, as these nation states will continually go to war, jockey for position, jockey for authority, for wealth. And the more different they become from each other, the more distinct and the fewer commonalities they have, the easier it is to go to war against somebody who is not like me. Anything else? All right. Well, we will catch up again in January. It's not going to be that very first Wednesday. It will probably be the second Wednesday. I will let everybody know, so we have plenty of advance warning. But I wish anybody watching, depending on when you're watching this, but how about just in a general sense, a very Merry Christmas and a truly holy, happy, and blessed New Year. And I'll hopefully see you before all that. So.